So we're talking about the development issues, but psychologically there were scars as well. And what seems to have happened, and this is what Manley spoke about, that it's difficult to get rid of the thinking because many of us have internalized the history and the legacies of colonialism. And indeed, such feelings are alive and well in Jamaica. When we affirm Buju Banton's, me love my car, me love my bike, me love my money and thing, I don't have to finish the song, you know it ends. When Jamaican DJ Vibes Cartel sings about Mr. Bleach Chin, where he associates wealth, privilege, and social status to the color of one's skin. When mothers and grandmothers straighten the noses of their children, you're familiar with that? Because it is too broad. I remember growing up, I see that in my family. When women and men bleach their skin, change the color of their hair to blonde, they're all ashamed of their blackness. And that is precisely what Norman Manley referred to in 1962 when he spoke about the difficulty in throwing off the behavior and thinking brought by 300 years of colonialism. He confronted similar behavior and thinking in 1962. And in 2017, we are confronting similar behavior and thinking 55 years later. And so the legacies of colonialism are alive and well. Colonialism has, in many ways, ladies and gentlemen, disfigured us, literally and figuratively. Now, in 1834, Britain had the opportunity to make amends to the enslaved peoples throughout the Caribbean. However, enslavers argued that the freeing of enslaved people by British legislation was a violation of their property rights, and they instead demanded compensation. Consequently, British planters received £20 million, or 200 billion pounds in today's money, from the British government as compensation for the loss of their property. And I use the word property in quotation marks. This represented at the time a staggering 40% of British public expenditure in 1834. Another sweetener was given to British enslavers, and that's the granting of apprenticeship. That's an extended period of 6 years of free labor. So if you were to think about it, the amount granted to enslavers would be much more than the £20 million. But there was no measure to compensate those formerly enslaved people who suffered trauma and humiliation associated with their enslavement. The enslavers claimed victimhood and put the claim to the British state as the defendant. Enslaved people got nothing. And when you go through the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion, those hopes and expectations that they had that would come with freedom were not fully realized, hence Paul Bogle, George William Gordon, and those individuals taking matters into their own hands. This unaddressed wrong, recognized even at the level of the United Nations, needs to be settled. So it is important for Jamaicans to understand what one professor at the University of London called a feeding frenzy of compensation. And so in the letter that I got, it said I should talk a little about Manchester. So I'm going to use reparations and compensation and use Manchester's history because I think it's important that we all should have some appreciation of what went on. Now, Jamaica at the time was Britain's largest and most prosperous colony. It ranked highest in the number of files claimed. So there were 16,114 claims that were filed for enslaved Africans in Jamaica by slave owners in Britain. And of the £20 million, they got a whopping £10.98 million. So more than half of the £20 million granted to enslavers were for enslaved people living in Jamaica. Now, if you can show slide 1 for me, please. So when you look at the breakdown on a parish by parish basis, it might be a bit difficult for all of you to see, so I will just read for you. Of the 16,000 claims that were filed, 668 were filed for enslaved people living in this parish. So of 16,000, 668 for Manchester Parish. Of the 668 claims that were filed, they were filed for over 32,000 enslaved Africans. So even though Manchester was not the typical sugar parish, it was nonetheless a parish of enslaved people. So 668 claims, 32,000 Africans at the time, and total compensation money of the 10 million for the parish of Manchester, 625,039 pounds. So if you look at the table, for those you can see, you'll see that Manchester did not rank highly like the more prosperous sugar parishes like St. Thomas in the east, Trelawney, St. James and Westmoreland and so forth. But nonetheless, 600 is still a lot. 32,000 enslaved Africans is still a lot, no matter what and how you look at it. So what I did was I spent some time to break down who got what for Manchester of the 668. Now, I'm not going to go through all 668. What I did was a top 10, ranking from the highest to the lowest. And so if the slide is not showing, then I'll call the names and I'll call some of the properties that were filed for, and maybe name association will be of use and helpful to you in that case. So I did for men and I did for women, and I'll explain that also in a minute. So the person who got the most money for enslaved people in Manchester was a gentleman by the name of Duncan Robinson. That's on the second table. Now, Robinson filed 6 claims for 943 enslaved people in this parish. Now, what were the properties? Let me give some of the names. Knockpatrick, many of you might be familiar with them. Oxford, Newhall, and Canewood. So, Duncan Robinson, 6 claims, 943 Africans. Oxford, Knockpatrick, Canewood, and Newhall. And his total compensation money was over £16,000. If you were to convert that into modern day equivalent, we're talking millions of pounds. I'll go through 2 more names because the table is there, and it's a pity not everyone could have a look at the table. Next in line was Stephen Denton. He filed 5 claims for Devon. Those of you are familiar with that. Somerset and Johnsall. 637 Africans he filed for, and he too received 12,419 pounds. And it goes on. James Daly filed for Derry, Good Intent, Halifax, Newfield. Henry Hyman for Albion, Isle and Mons. Not sure if some of those areas are still around. George James Crabb filed for Cedar Grove and Marlborough. Robert Crawford for Caledonia and Duff House, Woodsland and Scotia. I'm not sure of some of those, but you can associate with that. And even men of the cloth at the time were filing for enslaved Africans. So the Reverend Edward Owen filed 3 claims, 280 Africans. Hopeton and the Wilderness, those were the properties he filed for, and he received 5,702 pounds. So you see where men were filing for enslaved Africans, but also women were filing as well, because 20 million pounds, a lot of money, and everybody are submitting claims because they're saying, you know, on that particular property there in Jamaica, those are my quote-unquote property, and therefore abolition is seen as a violation of their property rights. So for the women, I've done a similar top 10, and so we'll start with Frances King. She filed 3 claims. So what you see is that women were not major slaveholders. They will file claims, but you will not see as many claims being filed by women as compared to men. So you have Frances King, 3 claims. Her property was Mount Pleasant and Strickland. She claimed 265 enslaved Africans, and she got £5,402 compensation money. Sarah Allman for Hanbury, 1 claim, 220 Africans. Caroline Atkinson Swaby, Waltham, that's where she filed, 213 enslaved Africans. Elizabeth Brooks, Lookout and Newhall. Anna Marie Heron, she filed in Wigton. Sarah Virgin for Hope, and Isabella Davy filed 2 claims, one for Bel Air and another for Belfield. A total of 158 Africans over almost 3,000 pounds. So many of you might be wondering, therefore, what did they do with all this money? There is copious evidence, there's enough evidence that the wealth generated from this, from enslavement and from compensation, was invested and reinvested in railroads, shipbuilding, insurance, the financial sector, the arts, the physical landscape, shopkeeping, and just about every facet, every conceivable facet of British society. So what you see, therefore, is a disconnect on one hand, where already rich enslavers are being compensated, and enslaved people who were humiliated and brutalized are getting absolutely nothing. So if you look at the next table makes fascinating reading, because what I've done is, for Jamaica, I've looked at Jamaica broadly, and I've looked to see who got the most money for Jamaica. So you'll see the table is there on table 4. A guy by the name of Roland Mitchell, he filed 30 claims. He was compensated £98,000 at the time, and when you convert that, it's £76.8 million today. And what he did with the money, he was the director of Guardian Fire and Life. I can go through, but in the interest of time, what I'll talk about is also Charles Selrick. He was compensated. He was at the time the director of the Royal Bank of Scotland. So you begin to see, therefore, what is being done with the money. And I'll end on this particular slide with John Gladstone. He was the father of the future Prime Minister of Great Britain, William Gladstone. He filed 9 claims, over £100,000 in compensation. So it is therefore disingenuous of some people to say that slavery is too far gone in the past for it to have contemporary relevance. Norman Manley showed us that in 1962, that the past continues to affect and impact the present. So it's disingenuous for people to say, well, the past is too remote, that the legacies are no longer evident among us today. There is overwhelming evidence to support the claim that the transatlantic trade and colonialism led to the underdevelopment of the Caribbean. Conversely, the profits of the trade industrialized Europe and Great Britain. Eric Williams wrote extensively about it, and enriched families in England at the time. Those benefits have continued to be passed on from generation to generation. What did enslaved people got to pass to their kids from generation to generation? Creating for those family members, access to education and material resources that have enabled them to achieve and maintain upward social mobility. Now, among those who the records have revealed to have benefited from slavery are ancestors of the former British Prime Minister. Many of you may have known this, many of you might be hearing this for the first time. David Cameron, former Minister Douglas Hogg, authors Graham Greene, George Orwell, poet Elizabeth Barron Browning. These are people who are still alive, where the records can be traced. If you follow the money, follow the compensation records and the money, you can see where their ancestry benefited from enslavement. Other prominent names which feature in the records include scions of some of Britain's wealthiest banking families, and oldest, I might add. So if you look at the Barings Bank, it's now defunct, was one of the world's most prosperous financial merchant banks at the time. They too filed compensation for enslaved Africans in St. Kitts. The second Earl of Harewood, or Henry Lascelles, also benefited from compensation, and he's also an ancestor of the Queen of England's cousin. Married into the royal family in 1922. The records are there. You can trace it, you can follow it. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is now widely acknowledged that Europe's rupture, dislocation, trafficking, and brutalization of over 30 million Africans constitutes modernity's greatest crime against humanity. And so what CARICOM is asking for is other words, to right those wrongs. And when we talk about reparations, people mistakenly, and the media is guilty of this too, for the wrong evidence. Reparations is not about a financial handout. That's not what CARICOM is asking for. So what I'll implore everyone to do today, as we talk about reparations, is to go and read on CARICOM's 10 points plan. Because what they're saying, what confronted Manley in 1962 is how to achieve and build a new Jamaica. And if you listen to the members of Parliament this morning, you'll realize that 55 years on, we're still faced with developmental challenges. That's what he was concerned about. And he acknowledged that colonialism might pose a fundamental, or the legacies of colonialism might pose a fundamental threat to his project of a new Jamaica. And we now see 55 years after that the Caribbean, as the minister said of finance, that per capita GDP in Jamaica is 5,500 United States dollars. So we're lagging behind, while other areas are doing extremely well. So the issue of reparations refuses to go away. When Paul Bogle fought in 1865, he wanted reparations. He wanted a new Jamaica. He wanted a Jamaica of equity, justice, and opportunities. In 1938, when those who were murdered in 1930, when they rose up, they were fighting for reparations. They wanted a society of equity, justice, and opportunities. So CARICOM's call for reparations is not a financial handout. And so I implore everyone to go and read, because we're faced in the 21st century with serious developmental challenges. And so what those members of the Reparations Committee are saying is, with this 10-point plan, that we should push forward. And so I'll just speak to you briefly about some of those plans in the interest of time. Number one, they're asking for a full formal apology. European countries should acknowledge responsibility, and they should commit to making amends. We're asking for the establishment of cultural institutions how many of us today will quickly acknowledge that we are Africans? I see just few hands. Right? Readily acknowledge. When you watch television, it's always interesting how disconnected we are, not only physically but culturally and psychologically, from all things African. You know, recently my friends were talking, let's watch the British FA Cup on television. How many times do we see the African Nations Cup on television? Cultural disconnection. We're also saying that we should address the public health crisis. Now, when I was a student at UWI, I got to realize that enslaved people were fed a very high sodium diet. Salted fish, salted pork, salted this, salted that, salted everything. And as one professor said, they were genetically modified. Because what some historians have shown is that problems that my grandmother, grandfather, and members of my family are having with hypertension can be traced back historically because of the diet and how they were fed on the plantation. And when you trap someone in a space no larger than a coffin for 64 days, yes, that person is going to be hypertensive in many ways because of the trauma today. So you see all of this manifested on descendants in the form of hypertension, but also type 2 diabetes, which is transmitted intergenerationally as well. We're pushing for illiteracy eradication. And when you look at colonialism, you know, I've heard when Marty Perkins was alive, bless him, many people would say Jamaica was better off under colonialism. Many of you have heard that argument. But when you look at it and look at the undereducation and miseducation of Afro-Jamaicans during the period of colonialism, and we're talking about illiteracy and some of the poor infrastructural and institutional things, legacies and institutions that we have been bequeathed by the Europeans. Illiteracy education is also one of them. Technology transfer is also something that CARICOM is pushing for. So broadly what I'm saying is, I'm not reading through all 10, is that the call for reparations pushed by CARICOM and others in our society is not a financial handout. It's a process that will facilitate us in the development, in facilitating development, the development that Norman Manley wanted for Jamaica, and one in which he realized that colonialism would pose a fundamental stumbling block in achieving. I'll end my talk with a quotation from Norman Manley, which is pointed, I think. And again in 1962, in this reflection of his New Jamaica, this project that he called the New Jamaica, he reflected in that speech. And I'll implore you, those high school students who are here, primary school students, that's one powerful address that you should all read. The 24th address to the People's National Party's annual conference. And he says, I remember how some of them, and by them, he's talking about those nameless, faceless Jamaicans, those unsung heroes and heroines of the past, who gave their lives that Jamaica might throw off 300 years of colonial bondage. He was referring to Nani, he was referring to Paul Bogle, he was referring to all of them. He reflected on them. To throw off 300 years of colonial advantage might lift up their hearts to aspire to all that independence means and freedom for a people. In other words, are we truly independent? So you go back and you reflect on what he says. And I'll end with this quote again, and allow me, Madam Chair, if you will. It says, I'll just end with this last quotation. We must never forget that we start with the legacies of 300 years of colonial rule. We would be foolish to think, or foolish if we did not understand, that you don't throw off all the patterns of behavior and thought that colonialism brings upon a people by merely becoming free. We have tried hard in this country to overcome them, but they are not yet overcome. 55 years later, Norman Manley's statement rings true. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time. of colonialism.